Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into how YouTube figures out what news you see.
Yeah, we're looking at their top news system, basically, trying to unpack how they decide what's authoritative.
Exactly, and why that matters for, the information you end up seeing.
It's super relevant if you're trying to get solid info efficiently. Understanding this helps you see sort of the potential filters.
For sure, and YouTube's huge for news, right? Especially
Yeah.
younger folks. What was it, like 20% back in 2018?
Something like that, yeah. And it's a real mix. You've got the big networks, independent people, citizen journalists even.
Which brings us to the whole misinformation issue and where algorithms fit in.
Right. YouTube talks about its 4 Rs: remove, reduce, raise, reward. We're zooming in on raise today, how they elevate certain sources.
Okay, so that's where top news and breaking news shelves come in, those special sections.
Precisely. Those are the main ways they showcase what they deem trustworthy.
So let's break that down. What exactly is top news?
Okay, so top news, that pops up when you actively search for news topics. Gets really prominent placement.
Like right at the top.
Yep. And maybe even on your homepage if you watch news often. Think like CNN, Fox News, the big names. They have to follow Google News rules to get there.
Gotcha. And breaking news, how's that different?
Breaking news is more for major unfolding events. It shows up right on your homepage, usually triggered by Google News signals for your region.
And it focuses more on reporting, less on just chatter.
Exactly. More reporting, less raw footage or commentary. And it's typically for signed-in users, 18 plus.
Interesting. So this idea of authoritative sources is pretty central.
It really is. But the catch is YouTube doesn't actually publish a list of who's on it.
Huh. So how do they decide then? What makes a source authoritative in their eyes?
It seems to be a few things working together. First, it plugs into the whole Google network, meaning it uses signals from Google Search and Google News, things like relevance, how fresh the info is, expertise signals. If a source is already recognized by Google News, that's a big plus.
So established players have a bit of an advantage there.
Definitely. They also have to stick to the Google News content policies.
Okay. What else? Is it just Google signals?
No, there's also machine learning involved, ML systems that are trained to prioritize these authoritative sources, especially for important stuff like news, politics, health info.
And people. Are humans involved in this loop?
Yes, they use human raters too.
Uh,
These people assess sources based on public guidelines, and that feedback helps train and refine the algorithms.
but we don't know exactly how those guidelines are interpreted or weighted.
Right, there's some opacity there.
So the algorithm is doing a lot of heavy lifting. How does it generally rank things?
Well, the standard YouTube algorithm looks at relevance, engagement, and what they call EEAT expertise, authoritativeness, trustworthiness.
Mhm.
But for these specific news features, authoritativeness and crucially freshness get bumped up in priority.
And are there specific signals just for the news shelves?
Yeah, things like local relevance, the topic itself, how new it is, live streams are important sometimes. Also, whether the channel is linked to a known Google News website.
Okay.
And of course, following YouTube's rules, regular recommendation signals, and this idea of reporting intent.
Reporting intent. That sounds a bit fuzzy. How would they measure that?
It's likely inferred, probably from channel categorization, links to news sites, maybe patterns in titles and descriptions, how often they post news, the format.
So it might lean towards more traditional journalism styles.
It could, yeah. That seems plausible.
And these news shelves, they're really visible, right? At the top of search or the homepage?
Absolutely. They get prime real estate, special carousels, visual distinction. It clearly signals this is the prioritized news content. Plus, there's a dedicated page, youtube.com/news.
What about context? Do they add anything else?
Sometimes, yeah. You might see information panels, links to Wikipedia for funding info, or maybe fact checks or background on a topic.
So it really separates this curated news from just general search results.
Definitely reinforces their definition of authority.
What does all this mean for creators, especially independent ones?
Well, for the established news orgs, designated as authoritative, it means more visibility, more views. YouTube even said consumption grew like 60% on partner channels.
Wow, so the system kind of funnels viewers towards them.
In those specific news sections, yes. It acts a bit like an authoritative gatekeeper.
And the independents.
They're generally outside that specific framework. They rely more on the main algorithm, which can be tougher for visibility, maybe monetization too.
Is there data on this?
Pew Research found similar numbers of popular channels for organizations versus independents, but the orgs post way more often. Independents tend to have longer videos. Trust is built differently too, right? Big brands rely on their name. Independents often build more relational trust with their audience. The algorithm might not capture that nuance as well.
So how effective is this whole approach? Does it solve the misinformation problem?
Hmm. The research is mixed. Some studies suggest the main algorithm might pull people towards entertainment anyway. Filter bubbles. Evidence is kind of inconclusive.
So misinformation is still a challenge.
Oh, definitely. And there's this inherent tension, isn't there? Promoting authority versus maximizing engagement. Those goals don't always align perfectly.
And critics point to potential bias in defining authority, right? Coming from Google News or the human raters.
Exactly. It could narrow the perspectives that get amplified.
What about transparency? How much do they actually tell us?
They have some things, like the funding notices linking to Wikipedia, info panels, aggregated data, and transparency reports.
What the core stuff?
Yeah, the actual list of authoritative sources, the precise weighting in the algorithms, how the ML models work, that's largely opaque. Makes independent assessment tricky.
How does this compare to, say, Facebook or Twitter X?
They're different. YouTube's quite centralized, leaning on Google News. Facebook has the personalized feed, uses third-party fact checkers. Twitter X is super real-time, uses labels, community notes, less structured elevation of authority, you could say.
Different platforms, different philosophies.
Pretty much. Different ways of tackling a similar challenge.
Okay, so to wrap up for our listeners, the big takeaway is YouTube actively curates news. It prioritizes sources it labels authoritative using a complex, somewhat hidden system tied to Google.
Yeah, and this really shapes what you're most likely to see in those dedicated top news or breaking news spots.
Which leads to thinking about, well, how does this curated system affect the diversity of news you actually find? Are good independent voices getting pushed aside?
It's definitely something to be aware of. Pay attention to where YouTube is pointing you for news. Maybe look beyond those main shelves sometimes.
Yeah, explore different creators, established and independent. Mix it up a bit.
And it leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? If the platform's algorithm is nudging you, even subtly, towards certain news sources, how much control do you really have over your news diet?